Paulo's real story of learning English. Part 1, the dream of working in an English-speaking country. Paulo, a 25-year-old from Rome, always dreamed of working in an English-speaking country. He loved technology and wanted to work for an international company. However, there was a big problem. He could barely speak English. Although he had studied some English in school and university, he never practiced speaking and listening. His dream job required fluent English, but every time he tried to speak, he froze with anxiety. His friends suggested taking more English classes, but after months of studying grammar and memorizing vocabulary, he still couldn't hold a conversation or understand native speakers. One day, he found a job opening in London for a company he admired. Even though his English was weak, he decided to take a bold step. He would move to London and learn the language by living there. Part 2, Arriving in London and the First Bitter Experience. Paulo arrived in London full of excitement, but his confidence disappeared the moment he landed. At the airport, he struggled to understand the immigration officer's questions and had to ask them to repeat multiple times, which was very embarrassing. Finding an apartment was another challenge. He booked a temporary room in a shared mock apartment, but when he met his British roommates, he barely understood their slang and fast speech. Even when he understood, he didn't know how to respond correctly. At a coffee shop, he tried to order breakfast. When the barista asked, "For here or to go?" he froze. He had no idea what they meant. After a long pause, he just pointed at a table. The barista smiled, understanding his confusion. These small failures made Paulo feel frustrated. He started doubting himself. Maybe I'll never learn English. Part 3, Failure and Changing the Learning Method. After a few weeks in London, Paulo realized that traditional language learning methods, like memorizing vocabulary and studying grammar, were not helping in real-life conversations. He still struggled to participate in discussions. One day, his British roommate told him, "If you want to learn English, you need to immerse yourself in it." From that day, Paulo changed his learning strategy, listening to podcasts and watching movies without subtitles. He listened to English podcasts daily and watched movies without subtitles. Speaking without fear of mistakes, he started talking to his colleagues at cafes or work, even if he made mistakes. Writing a daily journal in English, this helped him remember new words and phrases better. Part 4, Speaking Challenges and First Improvements. Paulo started practicing more, but speaking was still the hardest part of learning the language. He could translate words in his head, but when he tried to speak, his sentences were incomplete and scattered. Sometimes people patiently listened, but other times they became impatient. One day he was in a clothing store and wanted to ask about the right size for a coat. He said, "I need a coat, big, long for me." The shop assistant understood him but gave a detailed answer that Paulo could only half understand. At that moment, he felt like he had made no progress at all, but he promised himself not to give up. He tried a new method, talking to himself in the mirror. Every night, he picked a simple topic and spoke about it out loud, like, "How was my day?" or "What are my weekend plans?" After a few weeks, he noticed that his sentences were becoming smoother. But one particular event gave him even more motivation. Part 5, The First Successful Conversation. One day, Paulo was walking in a park when an elderly man sat next to him and smiled and saying, "Nice weather today, isn't it?" Paulo panicked for a moment but told himself not to run away. After a short pause, he replied, "Yes, very sunny, I like it." The elderly man continued talking about London and the changing weather. Paulo realized he understood about half of the conversation and even managed to ask a few simple questions. For the first time, he had a stress-free and enjoyable conversation. That night, he felt like he had truly improved. He gained more confidence and decided to put himself in more situations where he had to speak. Part 6. Overcoming Fear and Mistakes. After his successful conversation in the park, Paulo felt more motivated, but he still had a big problem: fear of making mistakes. Every time he wanted to speak in a new situation, his mind was filled with worries. What if I say something wrong? What if they don't understand me? What if they laugh at me? These thoughts sometimes made him avoid speaking. But one experience changed his perspective. One day, Paulo went to a cafe and decided to have a longer conversation with the barista. After getting his coffee, he said, "I am learning English. Sometimes I do mistakes." The barista smiled and said, "Oh, you mean I make mistakes? But that's okay. Your English is good." This sentence had a huge impact on Paulo. He realized that people actually didn't care if he made mistakes. From that day, he decided not to worry about errors anymore. "Oh, you mean I make mistakes? But that's okay. Your English is good." This sentence had a huge impact on Paulo. He realized that people actually didn't care if he made mistakes. From that day, he decided not to worry about errors anymore. He created a new habit: speaking to at least one stranger for 5 minutes every day. In stores, on the subway, in the park, wherever he found an opportunity, he tried to have a short conversation. At first it was difficult, but after a few weeks he noticed that speaking was becoming easier. He no longer feared mistakes and realized that people cared more about communication than perfect grammar. Part 7. Making English-speaking friends. One of the best ways to learn a language is to talk with native speakers. Paulo realized that to improve faster, he needed to make English-speaking friends. But how? First, he joined a language exchange group in London. Every week, people from different nationalities gathered to speak different languages. Paulo met some native English speakers and slowly became more comfortable speaking. But he also tried another method: joining a sports club. He joined a local football team and trained with them every week. At first, understanding his teammates was difficult, but over time, both his language skills and friendships improved. One of his new friends, James, suggested meeting weekly to practice English. They sat in cafes and talked about different topics. James corrected Paulo's mistakes, but in a friendly way that never made him feel bad. With this method, learning English was no longer a difficult task. It became a fun and social activity. Part 8. Confidence and using English in professional situations. By now, Paulo had mastered the English language and could comfortably speak in most social situations without stress. But a new challenge awaited him: using the language in professional settings. He remembered how, back in Italy, he always spoke with his colleagues in Italian. Now, living in London, he had to communicate with his coworkers and clients in English. This seemed like a daunting task as professional language, and job-specific terminology could be much more complex than casual conversations. 1. Preparing for work meetings. From the very beginning, Paulo decided to use various methods to improve his professional skills. He set up a daily study routine and focused on learning industry-specific terminology. He started by watching online educational videos where various professional topics were taught in English. This helped him familiarize himself with the language and terms commonly used in his field. He also read books and articles related to his job in English. In addition to this, he started practicing speaking during work meetings. Initially, he practiced with a friend who worked in the same industry, and prepared industry-specific sentences for real meetings. This way, when he attended actual meetings, he was no longer worried about his language skills. The first work meeting in English. One day, Paulo was invited to attend an important online work meeting with an international client. The meeting would involve speaking in English with people from different countries. He felt a bit nervous, but reminded himself of all the practice he had done. The meeting started, and Paulo began speaking, slowly and confidently. He used some of the technical terms he had learned. In the middle of the meeting, one of the clients asked him to explain a report. Paulo hesitated at first, but then he used simple and clear language to explain it. At the end of the meeting, one of his colleagues congratulated him and said that his performance was great. Paulo realized that the language was no longer a barrier for him. He had successfully communicated in a professional setting with confidence. 3. Conclusion: achieving full mastery. Paulo reflected on how far he had come in learning English. From the early days when he could only form simple sentences to now, being able to confidently speak in professional meetings. He was no longer just an average language learner. He had become fluent in English. He felt proud of himself for never giving up and continuing his efforts. English had become not just a challenge, but a tool for connecting with the wider world and unlocking new opportunities. Part 9. The journey continues. Living in London had opened up new opportunities for Paulo, but he knew that learning a language was a journey that never truly ended. Language is alive and always changing. Paulo now thought about the next stages of his language learning. Learning different accents. He had become interested in learning various English accents, such as American, Australian, and Canadian accents, teaching others. He also thought about someday helping others learn English. This could be a great way to motivate himself further. He knew there was still a lot to learn, but he was content with how far he had come. He could now speak English confidently in everyday and professional life. Paulo reflected on the days when he was afraid of making mistakes and felt embarrassed about his errors, but now he knew that nothing could stop his progress. The journey of learning a language was still ongoing. The end of the story.